Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Enhancing Water Security, whether regulated or not, with our guest from Alvaca. Things for you to know: if you cannot hear me, it's because Livestorm begins all of our webinars with your sound on mute. If you can't hear us, please click on the screen to turn on the sound. Please note your microphone will remain muted, but use the chat to talk to us. That is on the right-hand side. If the alerts become too much, you can mute them by clicking on the bell. We do want to hear from you, though, so please drop us a note. Tell us where you're dialing in from today. We're excited to hear from you. And if you would like to automatically get a recording, you're in luck. But if you would like the presentation slides, we'd like you to send us an email at ellie.miller@criticalinsight.com. Therefore, you can avoid the circular file of spam. Thank you so much for joining us. With that, I'm going to pass it over to today's speakers. Kevin, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me today. I'm Kevin McDonald. I'm the COO and CISO at Alvaca Networks. I've been with the company 22 years. Spend my life living, eating, and breathing in the world of cyber. We are primarily a ransomware rescue, restoration, and MSP. We spend a good part of our company time recovering very large enterprises down to your SMB networks, from ransomware. And law enforcement support background, the FBI InfraGard, U.S. Secret Services Cyber Fraud Task Force, and a few others. So eat, sleep, and breathe cyber.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. I am Mike Hamilton. I am the CISO here, also the founder of Critical Insight. My background for last 10 years before I started the company was in government. I was a policy advisor to the state of Washington through Office of the CIO. I was the CISO for the city of Seattle for about 8 years, vice chair of a Homeland Security Government Coordinating Council for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, focused on infrastructure protection. So that's me.
And I'm Bjorn Townsend, a senior consultant on the incident response team here at Critical Insight. I both help our clients when they experience incidents, something that these days I've been doing with Alvaca. I just worked an incident over the 4th of July weekend with those folks and had a fantastic experience with them. I also when I'm not doing incident response, I also do assessments and audits of systems for municipalities, most especially including water systems like we're going to be talking about today. I've run about 50 or 60 America's Water Infrastructure Act assessments for various water systems around Washington State and a few down in Oregon as well, and hope to do some more in the future.
All right. With that, let's get going here. So this particular subject, the reason that we are talking about this today, and as you know, we're not here to sell you stuff, we're here to tell you stuff. And this particular thing has been, I've been tracking this for a while, and it's gotten to the point where it's driven me crazy. So we thought we would come out and do this in a webinar for everybody. So let's talk about how we landed here. Okay, we are in regulatory purgatory right now, if that makes sense to you. So this all started Safe Water Drinking Act. Okay, we know this was codified in 1974, and then it was amended a few times. The most recent was 2018. Put a pin in that. We're going to come back to that. It is really intended to regulate water purity only. Okay, Safe Water Drinking Act, been around for a long time. All right, here is America's Water Infrastructure Act, which was signed into law in 2018, and the amended Section 2013, okay, the AWIA, America's Water Infrastructure Act, Section 2013, amended the Safe Water Drinking Act, Section 1433. Now that sounds wonky, and that sounds like weird round-off error. It's really important because that requires, okay, and this is law, this is not a presidential directive, this is not regulation making by a sector-specific agency like the EPA, this is law. And it says, water utilities, you have to develop risk and resilience assessments and emergency response plans, okay? And they have to include basically cyber risk assessment as part of it. That is the law. All right, and here's the industry trade group, the American Water Works Association, very influential. They published risk management guidance in 2019. Here's a copy of it. You can Google it and find it. All these things are kind of saying the same thing. I picked out, as I read this one, they use this term. They noted that cyber incidents are a foreseeable risk. The reason that that is critical language to pay attention to is because there is something called the standard of foreseeability as a doctrine in the legal profession. And what it says is, and I'll paraphrase, if you fail to take steps to mitigate an identified risk, a foreseeable risk, you are guilty of negligence. That's what that is. That's why they use that language. Okay, radar up, right? They talked about all kinds of costs of inaction here, right? And that's where they're going with this, these claims of negligence that have been showing up more and more lately. Not necessarily in the water sector, but in corporations that have failed to take these steps, change healthcare high. And interestingly, it also recommends using the NIST cybersecurity framework for conducting risk assessments. It's a great tool for that. Okay, go to 2023. The EPA issued some water security mandates. The way that they did it, okay, there's this ecosystem out there which has sector-specific regulatory agencies that through the rulemaking process can regulate their sector. The EPA is the SSRA for the water sector. They copied what the Coast Guard did with ports. The ports always have to do a facility security plan I think it's every 2 years. And so Coast Guard came in and said, well, since you have to do that, we would like you to submit a cyber risk assessment along with that. And everybody said, okay, we'll do that. The EPA tried to do the same thing with the water sector, saying, hey, water sector, you already have to do this sanitary survey, remembering that the original intent was to regulate water purity. Along with that, we would like you to submit a cyber risk assessment. 3 states sued the EPA. This is an unfunded mandate. And so in July, the EPA backed off. And they said, oh, okay, we'll do this a different way. That was the first, I think, chink in the armor for the administration's efforts to use the sector-specific regulatory agencies to implement cyber controls, starting all the way back when the Colonial Pipeline was impacted and 45% of the fuel supply on the East Coast was hammered. And the administration started poking around and saying, well, who's the sector-specific agency for pipelines that's supposed to regulate them? Oh, it's the TSA. TSA, get after it. Start telling them what they need to do. And all of the other sector-specific regulatory agencies started to do the same thing. Health and Human Services for the healthcare sector, for example. All right. So here we've got this ecosystem set up, and the EPA has now just been shouted down by these 3 states. Okay. And now stuff is starting to hit. So interestingly, thank you, 3 states that sued, because 2 weeks later, Iranians started to hit programmable logic controllers in water utilities that were Israeli-made products. Okay. This wasn't a sophisticated attack. This was an attack of opportunity. Turns out the folks that implemented these PLCs at these water utilities never changed the default passwords, meaning that all you had to go was look it up on the internet, march right in and do whatever you wanted to do. And that's what happened. Okay. So that's how bad our water utilities are. Not all of them, but remember, they are very broadly distributed across the country, and some are very small. They don't have the kind of resources, either financial or human resources, to take the steps necessary to secure those facilities. All right. All right. Well, here's everybody's warning us. CISA's warning us. The FBI is warning us. So the government said, okay, well, we can't regulate through this rulemaking process. We don't want to get sued. So here's some tips, water utilities, and we'll show you the list of those tips in a second here. And then now, after this happened, there were more water utilities compromised, and the Russians actually held up their hand and said, yeah, we did it. And so, again, these were not very sophisticated. We don't think that these were actually Russian state actors. We think that these were part of the organized crime ecosystem in Russia / their activists, right? There's a lot of activism going on now in wartime. And since the geopolitical situation in the world has gone crazy, the gloves have come off and people are starting to do all kinds of things. Okay, so here's the threats that are now coming faster. So we've got to do something. Our water sector is at risk. We've seen exactly how much at risk. If you can march in, you know, just by looking up a password on the internet, we need to implement some controls here. Okay, So here's the current status. All right. So the EPA is looking to reduce risks from Iran, China, Russia to the water sector. So the EPA sent out these tips. And right after that, they sent out a letter to all of the governors, 50 state governors, asking for state plans to secure the water sector in your state. And by the way, here are the tips. Here are the controls that we suggest you implement. So we think that's going to come out in these state plans. And then, and this is a big deal, the EPA issued these enforcement measures. All of this stuff is Googleable, and if you get the daily news blast from Critical Insight, you already know about this. But look at the wording here. So the risk assessment must include electronic computer or other automated systems, otherwise known as cybersecurity, lifting the specific language from the amended Safe Water Drinking Act. Okay? So we're not kidding around here. The EPA says we will enforce this. We have an existing law on the books. It's not an executive order from the president. It's not the rulemaking process from the sector-specific regulatory agencies that have been shouted down. This is the law. This is exactly the wording from the law. Pay attention to this. All right, what would those enforcement measures be? And here's where we loop back to this standard of foreseeability and the potential for being accused of negligence. They will take civil and criminal enforcement actions. This is a week old. This is not old news. This is very, very recent news. So they're going to conduct inspections to ensure that they're meeting their requirements to regularly assess resilience vulnerabilities. Okay. A resilience vulnerability. What is that? That is your inability to take a punch and get up off the mat because they think the punch is coming. All right. Everybody today on the global internet gets punched. Some of them bounce back. Some of them go out of business. Right. A water utility is not allowed to go out of business, so you have to bounce back. Okay. So emergency response plans include cybersecurity and risk assessments, et cetera, et cetera. So this has all become very confusing. And now this. So last week, the Supreme Court overturned the Chevron deference doctrine. Okay. And what that did, it said the executive agencies, in this case, the sector specific regulatory agencies, the EPA regulates the water sector. They were the ones that were allowed to interpret the laws that they were tasked with enforcing. So the law means this. So we want you to do this. Right? Now that that has been taken away, now it's going to be up to Congress and courts to figure out what is meant by what is a risk assessment. Okay? And there is no one less qualified on God's green earth to adjudicate those things than our Congress. I'll just say that. Right now, this kind of thing, because this is a precedent that's been set with, again, this ecosystem of, regulating our critical infrastructure, this is very likely going to cascade down to other sectors. And so when it becomes the standard for a regulated sector to ignore the guidance from the sector-specific regulatory agency, or go judge shopping for another opinion and go to Congress or the courts for another opinion, this is going to get weird. So this has wounded our critical infrastructure protection systems that have been in place for a while. When I said I was the vice chair of a government coordinating council for state, local, tribal, and territorial, all of the critical sectors have this, these pieces that go together as sector-specific or a sector-specific council, a government coordinating council where you talk to government, right, rather than your own peers in the business, an ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and that sector-specific regulatory agency. That is the ecosystem that was set up, and I know I'm saying ecosystem way too many times, but that was what was set up originally for critical infrastructure protection after 9/11. All these pieces have been in place. All right. And so there's a headline right there. Chevron decision crushes Washington's approach to cyber regulations. Not state of Washington. It's the other one. Okay. So that's where we are. All sounds clear what to do, right? Well, this is what we were hoping, I think, to deconvolve on today's presentation. And honestly, nobody's going to be surprised by this. More than 70% of surveyed water systems failed to meet EPA cyber standards. I can live without a credit card. I cannot live without a flushing toilet and drinking water. Right? Let's try and focus on what's important here, right? The infrastructure that, if disrupted, will affect us at the scale we actually live our lives, not some abstraction of something. It's something I depend on for my life is now no longer available. We're pushing right up on that. And meanwhile, there are wars going on, everybody's gloves are coming off, and we're starting to see more warnings from all of our law enforcement agencies and Homeland Security about actors already being in our infrastructure waiting to pull the trigger. The narrative that we hear most often is, as soon as something happens in Taiwan and the Chinese decide they want to take Taiwan and we show up in the South China Sea, our lights go out, our toilets don't flush. That's where we're headed, folks. Okay, let's talk about the statewide planning that's been requested by the White House. And again, this is a request by the White House, so it's a little hard to ignore. So yes, our water sector is very poorly protected. Okay, nation state actors and others are threatening them. Potential impacts, and remember, the water sector includes waste treatment. And if you knock over a waste treatment plant, in 3 days, we have a vicious health emergency. So SSRAs can't make this regulatory change anymore, or at least they're going to get confronted in the courts if they do. It has said we're taking the law as written, the 1978 law as amended, word for word, and we're going to enforce against that language. So don't know if the Supreme Court's ruling has invalidated their ability to do that enforcement, but now we have to ask these questions. Okay, so if governors have been asked to do statewide planning for your water facilities, what should they be planning for? What should they be doing? Okay, what should your utility be doing, whether or not you're being guided by your governor or regulated through the EPA, for whatever that means now? What should you be doing? Okay, I would not take a passive position on this and wait for absolute guidance or regulation to come on you. Something's got to be done right now. So what are you going to do? This is the control list when they say they put out their tips. And this is all pretty standard stuff. I mean, this is nothing that you don't find in any other regulatory requirements anywhere. So, reduce exposure to the public-facing internet. Y'all think you're disconnected from the internet, and certain among us know that is generally not true. And if
almost never true.
Almost agreed. Almost never true.
Yeah.
Change conducts regular assessments. Okay, when they say do a risk assessment, well, you're going to either need to do that or you're going to need to bring somebody in to do that. And again, the guidance is to use the NIST cybersecurity framework. We get to the end here, we have a spreadsheet, a tool that we'll give you that you can use for that. Change default passwords immediately. All right, I mean, this is really 1A guidance, but that's kind of where we are. So the intent here is to raise the risk bar so that criminals of opportunity are not going to be your problem. The activists, okay, the anonymouses of the world that are in Eastern Europe and Russia, you don't want that to be your problem. If anybody's going to take down your water facility, you want it to be really sophisticated nation state actor that had to fight through some controls to get there, all right? It's still a foreseeable event, but if you raise that risk bar by implementing these controls, they're going to move along and find a softer target. So here are these 8 things. You can expect these to show up in whatever your governor hands you as to here's our go forward plan for the water sector. It, incumbent, I think, on governors to think through this more than just here's a bunch of controls we want you to implement. All we've done is repackaged what you've already been told by the EPA and DHS. And so let's think through this a little better. By the way, all the links that we have in the presentation, if you want the actual presentation and not the PDF version so that the links are hot, as Virginia said, you can ask us for that. the PDF will be made available, and you can probably scrape a link out of there and use it too. Okay. If I'm a governor and I am being advised by people that reasonably know what they're doing, here's what I'm being advised to do. And these are just my list here. And I've actually advised governor, and these are more than just the application of controls. And the first one is the most important: address sustainable funding. All right. This stuff costs money. If you have to hire people, it's going to cost money. Okay, so are you going to do that through rate hikes? Are you a bond? I mean, how are you going to do that? Because grant funding is one-time funding, and all of this stuff has to be durable. Address the people problem for real. Get some interns. If that's all you can do, get some interns. Every school has got their bright new shiny cyber degree program, and they're all looking for, you know, places for their students to do internships and capstone projects. Have them do risk assessment for you. Have them put eyes on logs for the duration of their internship, whatever. The national labs have come up with products that lend themselves to monitoring in these organizations. And remember, monitoring is how you manage impact. Okay, preventive controls shrink the likelihood that something is going to happen. And when it happens, monitoring and good response is how you limit that impact. The help desk cleaned up somebody's workstation is okay. We have been crushed with ransomware is not okay. And the difference between those two impacts is whether or not you're seeing what's going on the network and you're able to put out the grease fire on the stove before the house is engulfed in flames. There are nonprofits around too that you can tap. Pisces is one of those. Public Infrastructure Security Cyber Education System. Pisces is partnering with Department of Homeland Security to implement that Malcolm stack, which is specifically for operational technology monitoring, into public utilities, and have Pisces students all over the country monitoring that. So there are ways to lean into things that don't cost money. At the end of the presentation, we have scads of links to free stuff. Focus on resilience. And here's where I'm going to turn over to Kevin in a second because I talk too much. But this bit about being able to take a punch. You got to plan and practice incident response. You have to make sure that you have backups that are in place and there's multiple copies of them, and some of them are off site, et cetera, et cetera. Also, if you are the governor, and I have been through this process and it's real sausage making, make sure that your state has an annex to the state's comprehensive emergency management plan for significant cyber disruption. If this happens to a bunch of things all at once, where are the resources going to come from to help put everything back together? You got to think through this, and that's got to be practiced too. There have been national scale exercises for things like this. You can use the state guard under Title 32 and a training mission, right? Title 32 is you're working for the state governor. You know, I think it's Title 10 is you're working for the federal government and it's wartime. All right. Well, this is not wartime yet, but you can use the guard, and when they are on their training missions, to say, do a penetration test of that water utility. They do this. They've done this for us. And I would say lean heavily into these tools that we're going to enumerate here at the end of our discussion that are largely free. So here we go. So Kevin, I'm going to hand this over to you. You have control. Talk about your utility and resilience.
Fantastic. Thank you. So let's start with the fact that I want to back you up on one thing that was important to note, and that is funding is really one of the biggest challenges in many of these utilities, including water in particular. A lot of small mutuals are funded locally and don't have the ability to hit a large tax base or get funding from anybody other than their consumer. And so to have unfunded mandates is a pretty interesting problem for many of them. I actually participated in a process where we tried to get a utilities commission to give additional funding for cyber investment, and they were flatly told no. We have a disadvantaged community and we're not going to give you any more money. Figure it out with the budget that you have. So I think all of us advocating for more money and advocating for this to get funded is really important. We can't do this alone. I suggest right now that your utility start looking for funding for next year and the year after now, because if you don't, the lobbying effort, I think you're going to find out you're behind the ball. So you also can look at state and local cybersecurity grant programs. There are programs through DHS. There are state programs. Some counties I'm aware of are also doing some funding. And it is important, again, to get ahead of those. I just went through a process with an organization in the state of Washington, in fact, and it was a pretty comprehensive process for that individual to identify, one, what they need, two, what they're going to need long term, and three, who's going to do the work, what it's going to cost, et cetera, all had to be answered within the framework of the state's documentation. So you have to start that process now. One of the things I think is important also is to begin identifying what you have. You cannot defend what you are unaware of. And you certainly can't defend the sprawl without having a mapping of what is called your external perimeter in today's world. Today, fortunately, the perimeter is now the cloud and the home office and wherever else, but it's technically your perimeter. So you need to immediately become aware of what you have. I want to tell you with all due importance, please look at your legacy systems. One of the things that Michael said a little bit ago is about the fact that passwords were default. I have been told more times than I can tell you by the administrator, I don't know, I didn't set that password. So part of the assessment process that you need to do in this mapping of the perimeter and inventorying of your technology is to look at the configuration and the credentials. Are they old? Are they weak? Are they under the old protocols? Have they been changed in the last 90 days or 6 months as they should be? Or are they on a regular rotation? It's very important with credential stuffing and the power of brute force tools today that you absolutely have to not, one, reuse passwords, and two, don't use patterns, and three, stop making weak passwords that are guessable. I think the library that was just stolen is somewhere around 1 billion plus passwords. So they're going to throw those into a library and throw them against your password in your network. They're going to have it in a few minutes. Conduct scans. Be very careful when doing this with operational technology, because if you use the wrong tool, they call them packet cannons for a reason. You hit the wrong part of a network with a scanning tool and you can cause yourself problems, but you absolutely must look at your network from the perspective of configuration and vulnerability. That can be a software vulnerability. It can be a poorly configured device. It can be a device that has a full stack capability that doesn't need it. An OT device, for example, that has complete computing power that only this much of it's being used and it's never even been looked at for patching. Pay very close attention to the inventory of your devices and scan them for whatever you can find, as I call the low-hanging fruit of vulnerability identification. Conduct risk assessments and use the NIST cybersecurity framework or a similar framework. I do recommend NIST for government entities in particular, because if you're looking for safe harbor from willful neglect accusations, the fastest way to do that is use the government's own tools.
Yes.
So you can say, hey, I followed your guidelines and I did what you all recommended. Now, you can layer over that, and I do recommend that you go a little further and a little deeper, of course, but start there. If we can get back to the basics, another point Michael made earlier that's really important is that a lot of the stuff that happens out there is low-hanging fruit. It's easy attack. It's wide open. It's something that's been known for years to be a vulnerability, and it's facing the internet with no properly managed firewall or networking. So even though OT is a different environment and it takes different security, it is often behind the walls of an IT network. If you have an open-ended IT network and you have that connection without the gap that is required, you've basically just invited someone like a Chinese APT40 to come in and take over based on a known vulnerability that they're scanning for in any given day. Create a corrective action plan with budget estimates. It's great to do an assessment. First of all, with your assessment, it actually has to have a summary of remediation. I see a lot of reports that just identify vulnerability and they really don't have a plan. What is it you need to do to fix it? Is there even a fixable possibility within that particular device or the way it's constructed? Do I have to reconsider a tear down and a rebuild, or a shutdown and turnaround completely? These are all things that should be considered in the assessment, and it should come with budget estimates, timelines. Nothing happens overnight, and everything is dependent on prior action. You need to have an incident response plan. As you all know, Michael, we've worked together with your group. You guys do hundreds of these incident responses. We've done hundreds in the last few years. one of the major things that's missing is an incident response plan, or they have it and it's got dust on it. Nobody's ever read it and have no clue how to action it, or it's built around a network that doesn't even exist anymore. So you have to consider those actions that need to be taken immediately. You have to consider who's going to do them and how they're going to get done and who's going to make the tough decisions, because the last thing you want to do in the middle of an incident is start planning, because it's too late. Do tabletop exercises, and I say this across the board. This should be done for cyber incident, physical, and other emergencies that have to do with fire and potential flood, because every emergency has its own idiosyncrasies and the things that you may or may not have to do to change them. By going through tabletop exercises, you're going to have a much better idea of where your weaknesses are and the people that you have or the plan that you've come up with. And you'll find out things like, here's a good example, many of the cases we walk into, the people that are running the network have stored everything on the network that's just been encrypted by a ransomware actor. All their passwords, all their diagrams, all their license and vendor information, employee contacts, everything are encrypted. How do you do an incident response plan when that plan has been encrypted on the network? So have it, study it, know it, store it offline, and make sure that you have access to the things that you need when an event happens. Involve your local regional utilities. It's really an interesting thing that happens when you develop a community dynamic in testing like this, because all of a sudden you get all these various minds who think differently. A municipality may think very differently than a private organization, but in all truth, they ultimately have the same goal, which is to bring back up services for the community. Look at your backups. You need to look at your backup. You need to look at your target of your backup, meaning what is being backed up? How often is it being backed up? Is it often enough to not create deadly deltas, as I like to call them, deadly data deltas? It's great to have a backup, but it's 15 days old and you're operating within a few days of your margin and income, and you can't bill because all your records have been deleted. You need to make sure that your RTO and your RPOs are accurate and have been considered. Then you need to make sure those backups are immutable. You have to consider that threat actors are ultimately going to be you. They will very likely have administrative rights when they get into your network. So can they delete, corrupt, encrypt, or otherwise interrupt your backup? And if they can, then your backup is not going to be very useful to you. So you have to consider, if a threat actor gets control of my network, what are they going to be able to do, and what do I need to do to stop them from doing it? Consider an incident response retainer, and that should include your DFIR and forensic investigations team, your restoration team that's going to be responsible for remediating what's found by the incident responder and the forensics team. You should have an attorney that you already know by name and have their cell phone number, because the last thing you want to do is find a good breach lawyer via the Yellow Pages or Google search. Just gave my age away on the Yellow Pages. And then you also want to make sure that you have all of the particular services that you might need, and you will discover those better by having an incident response test. You'll know by doing tabletop, you'll realize, oh man, I didn't even think about the fact that I might need to call my SaaS firewall provider and my internet provider to help me redirect traffic or open ports or whatever it is that's required to manage a situation like that. Insurance is a critical, important element. This is something that I'm pretty passionate about. You have to make sure you have the right insurance, the right provider, that the weasel clauses have been considered, meaning all the ways the insurance company can get out of paying the claim when it comes. Do they pay prior to a triggered event? I've seen policies that say once it's been declared a breach, we start to pay. Well, in some cases, it can be a week or two before a breach, as the fine definition is found, actually is triggered. So all of your pre-breach incident expenses are not covered if you don't have the right coverage. You need to make sure you have ransomware coverage in particular. Very important that you have limits, decent limits on paying ransoms, because I hate to say it, even those that declare in writing they will never pay a ransom, about 80% ultimately do when they get ransomware, because it's either you pay it or you go away. And about 60% of the companies that pay it and recover still ultimately go away due to reputational damage and the other.
Yeah, I'll add to that too, that if there is an incident and you need to call your insurance company, probably the first line of that policy says, if something happens, call us first, and they will make the decision as to, I mean, this is a business decision on their part now as to whether or not that ransom gets paid. So
That's right.
just paying it and not calling your insurance company could be very bad.
Couple of other minor things or important things that are minor, meaning in the minor amount of time here. Privilege is a very, very, very important consideration when you have a cyber incident. You have to be very careful about who you talk to and what you tell them, and you have to be careful about how that's structured. So the sooner you can get your breach counsel involved and wrap privilege around the conversations that you're having, the better. And letting your entire staff know, for example, what's going on may feel good, and it may be the right thing in the way of, to make people understand what's happening, but it's not likely a very wise thing to do from the perspective of potential liability and privilege management, meaning legal privilege of the privacy of the what happened. Any announcement you make cannot be taken back. Any email you send cannot be taken back. It is critical that you get tied to an attorney who is not your general counsel as your primary privilege, because in some cases, if it's your regular attorney, they're like your staff. So you really need to have an attorney that's hired for the breach to handle that. And the insurance company may hire breach counsel, but you have to make sure that that's what they're there for. They're for you, not there for the insurance company themselves. And otherwise, you may not get the satisfaction that you're looking for. With that, Bjorn?
Sure thing. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about what kinds of attacks you could see in that sort of nightmare scenario that Mike was talking about. Thus far, we've seen relatively unsophisticated attacks against water utilities. When the nation state actors really take their gloves off, though, what does that look like, and how would they do it? Like, what would that impact look like, and just how bad could this really be? So let's dive into the pieces of a water system for a moment and explore that question. Now, for the folks who aren't deep in the weeds on the technical stuff here, the main thing that you need to understand at the outset is that there are small industrial computers called programmable logic controllers, and there's a picture of one on this slide. That's a Simatic S7 1500 programmable logic controller, or PLC for short. Those Siemens PLCs are overwhelmingly the most common around the world. They have a vast share of the market. I think it's like 60 or 70% around the world. And those are obviously, therefore, the most popular targets. Siemens will also sell them to just about anyone. So, the threat actors have plenty of opportunities to get their hands on them. So all of the components, all the moving parts in a water system, from the motors that draw water out of a well to the same motors that control the fluid levels in a storage tank or a reservoir, the booster pumps that would drive that water up the hill to your house at the top of the hill, the metering system, and then there's a whole collection of issues on the wastewater line. Those are all places that these PLCs have a role. They're the things that tell the motors when to turn on and off. They're the things that are telling valves when to open and close and how much. They also tell those pumps how fast to pump. And they're also the thing that's responsible for telling the water system operators what's going on in the system. What are the pressure levels? How high are the fluid levels? What are your chlorine injector settings? And all sorts of other information that's necessary in order to manage a water system. And all of that is information that you need to know, like, kind of in real time, because a water system takes a lot of management in order to keep bacteria levels down and purity at the appropriate level. All of those things are, kind of require a little bit of a light touch, but a constant touch on the wheel to maintain equilibrium. And those PLCs have vulnerabilities. There was a vulnerability that was discovered in 2021 by a team of researchers who were actually working for Siemens. I want to be clear that this was not a threat actor who uncovered this vulnerability. This was a team that Siemens employed to try and improve the security of their product because they knew that they had some issues there. And that team pretty quickly found that they were able to develop an exploit that allowed them to run what's called undetected remote code execution. That is, they were able to reprogram the firmware, the operating system that PLC runs on, remotely without having to authenticate against the PLC. They didn't even need to be able to log into it. And if you have the ability to rewrite the firmware, that fundamental operating system code of a PLC, then you can make it lie to its operators about anything in that environment. It can give false readings. It can say that pump levels, pump speed is much faster or much slower than it is. It can say that a valve is open when it's closed, or vice versa. And that means that threat actor can do the same sorts of things to your water system that you normally do, but they'll do it without you knowing about it. That system might show totally normal readings while the attack is going on, but somebody who's actually standing in front of the pump would see it kick on when it's not supposed to be. So we've talked a little bit about the PLC, but the PLC fits into this wider SCADA world of supervisory control and data acquisition. So the PLCs are these sort of assembly line workers that like open and close those pumps and turn on motors and so forth. They work on mechanical systems. The SCADA system is the overall sort of factory manager that coordinates all of that activity across the system. And as part of that system, there's also typically a historian that records all the data, the historical data of what that system has done. And you actually generally have to provide some of that data to the EPA as part of its the Safe Drinking Water Act purity check requirements. So that historical data is actually pretty important. And all of those things are going to be targets for the threat actors. So what would a really sophisticated threat actor try to do to not just inconvenience people, not just cause a minor incident at one plant? What would they do if they really wanted to cause havoc using all of these systems? Something probably a little bit like this. So in the case of the motor that pulls water out of a well, you can overheat that and burn that out. Those things are expensive. They cost like $25,000 a piece. You have to order a new one from like Japan or Germany or something. Takes a while. If everyone needs a new one at once, that's going to be a problem. There's also physical access issues that are associated with this. I've done a lot of inspections where wells and well pumps for drinking water were not really secured. Like they'd just be in the middle of a public park and you could pretty much walk right up to them. There wasn't even a locking cap on the well, and anyone could just go and dump industrial waste or radioactive material or any other kind of poison that you could think of down that well. And that drinking water is then poisoned forever. You can't clean up a well that's had somebody forcibly inject bad stuff into it. Another thing that you could do is, and this is something that I actually use a lot in tabletop exercises for incident response. Imagine it's peak fire season and you're already having to warn residents not to use too much water. And maybe there's even a raging forest fire near your town that is, and your firefighters need all of your water to battle that forest fire. Well, if a threat actor tells your reservoirs and storage tanks to start emptying themselves, that could mean that you're out of water and you have no water to fight fires with. If your surrounding cities that you have intertie or interlocal agreements with are also in the same boat, then you could end up with a massive regional problem. We've also seen, at least minor attacks against chlorine injectors, like the Oldsmar, Florida attack, where somebody modified the injection of sodium perchlorate. They tried to increase the injection rate to a high level. Well, the fortunate part of that is that it was a very unsophisticated actor doing that, and there are also physical controls that are in place that will prevent a suitably large dose of chlorine from being injected into the water supply, just because you can't inject enough. The hole isn't big enough. The flow rate of chlorine into that system is not high enough because there's too much water moving through it. It just gets safely dispersed to a safe level. Well, but what if you were to run the booster pumps that are feeding water past the chlorine injectors? What if you were to run those at a trickle and say you're running them flat out? If you reduce the amount of water that's coming into the system and you increase the amount of chlorine that's coming into the system, then yeah, you can put chlorine at dangerous levels, even if you're normally not able to inject chlorine fast enough. If you're not injecting as much water as you would be at the same time, that could still poison people. Running those chlorine injectors at maximum and running the booster pumps at a trickle is another nasty thing you could do. Even more permanent damage, however, could be done with water hammer effects. That's where you might quickly reduce and then quickly raise water pressure in a certain section of the system. If you've ever heard of the water hammer effect, water is very massive, very heavy. If you imagine a big semi truck full of water, it's got plastic sides on it, and that semi truck stomps on the brakes really fast. This is an actual thing that happens to fire engines. Like, one of the reasons why fire departments have to drive them kind of carefully is because if you slam on the brakes of a fire engine, all of that water will punch through the front of the fire engine's tank and break the truck. You can do the same thing to a water main. And, if an attacker did that to a city, then it could be months before the city would have running water again. Then we need to talk about what you could do to the wastewater system, and that's down in the lower right there. So it's not just about making it so that your toilet won't flush. Another thing that you could do is actually create a sewage fountain in your toilet. Again, with that back pressure that I mentioned, if you reverse all of those pumps and the direction that water is flowing, you can cause sewage to back up in people's sinks and back up in their toilets and literally create fountains of sewage that aerosolize all the coliform bacteria in that sewage and spread it over every surface. So imagine all the restaurants in your city. Sewage is billowing up out of their sinks, out of the bathrooms, and none of the food in those places is edible. And pretty quickly you'd have a contaminated drinking water supply as well. So that's how you could sicken or even kill hundreds of thousands of people through a cyber attack on a water system. It's pretty scary stuff, in my opinion, and we should probably do something about it. Mike, go ahead.
That backup, actually, there was a pretty major case a few years ago where somebody who got refused as a hire decided to back up sewage into a hotel and did it repeatedly from a remote control through a Bluetooth device, or a radio device. So very interesting theory and very real as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to talk about radio telemetry as well, because one other place is all of the sensors that have to be out to measure flow rates and tank depths and all of the measurements that need to be taken so that the SCADA system makes these decisions on, should I open this valve, should I close this valve, etc. And it's also possible to pollute the incoming signal to fool. And Bjorn, you touched on this, right? What if what I'm seeing on my screen is not the truth? And the way to make that one of the ways to make that happen is to pollute the signal that's coming in, which is your telemetry about where everything needs to be. And so the wireless, exactly. I wasn't going to say Stuxnet, but yeah, now that's very sophisticated. And again, if you get hammered by a nation state, that's, your insurance company is going to cover you. The government's going to be okay with that. If you get hammered by a criminal of opportunity, and I almost picked a different name, but if you, a script kiddie, they're not going to look kindly towards that. So that's why you got to raise your own risk bar. Okay. Now let's talk briefly here. Go ahead.
One thing that I really want to cover very quickly, there, on the subject of communication across the system, there has been a pretty significant move towards using cellular data services for communication rather than plain, regular ham radio or a variety of other technologies. And there are a couple of key risks with mobile cellular data that I want to make sure that everyone is aware of and understands. One is the risk of SIM swapping. Just like SIM swapping can happen to your cell phone, it can happen to a cellular radio for a water system. That would be a social engineering attack against the cellular provider that you're working with. Every month you need to check your bills and verify that there are no new SIM cards that have popped up on your account that are mysterious or that you can't account for. And I strongly recommend making sure that if you can, make sure that your telecommunications provider is reaching out to you and proactively notifying you if one is being added as sort of a SIM swapping protection. Another would be choose your mobile provider carefully and make sure that you're using something like FirstNet, a first responder focused system, because you don't want your water system ceasing to be able to communicate in the middle of a wider natural disaster because those the cell towers are being used for emergency services and you're not on the list.
I think an add to that point is to make sure, for the same reason, that you use FirstNet, because you don't want the fake cell towers being used to intercept your transmissions, which are, I mean, we've seen it all over the place, and we know the government has them officially, but I know of several people who have done that as part of their testing and spoof work. So penetration testing teaches us a lot, and one of the things we do have to be concerned about is if you're using cellular in the regular commercial network, much more likely to be picked up and interfered with.
Yeah, and that, in fact, what you talked about, Kevin, there was something called a stingray, right? And a dirt box is another variant of that. That's the way you would do an actor in the middle attack, so that you're rerouting things through your little suitcase here, which is simulating a cell tower, and then you change it and send it off to the cell tower. That's how you could do an attack like that. And that is not difficult to pull off.
And we know from Celebrite that these organizations are willing to sell them commercially. So it isn't like, only the government has them. We all have to be aware that these cybersecurity companies they sell tools that are legitimate. And I'm not saying that they are intentionally selling to bad people. The bottom line is they sell things to commercial entities that allow them to do things that they may not be able to do as a regular civilian.
Yep.
Mike, will you buy me one for my birthday? I've been good.
How old are you going to be? Okay.
I'll be 45.
You'll be 45. All right. I'll get you a dirt box. We fly down on a plane over Seattle, see what you see.
That sounds
so
cool.
Briefly, because we don't need to do a deep dive into this, there are a lot of resources out there that are available for you. And so, again, if you want this deck in PowerPoint form, we'll give that to you, no problem. Ask Ellie for it. We are going to make the PDF available. So you can also, and you can Google any of these things. They're super easy to find. There's a lot of guidance here, as well as free tools. We will give you, if you ask for it, a NIST cybersecurity framework assessment tool that makes these cool spider charts and pie charts and all kinds of things. And a friend of mine at Clear Channel Outdoors worked with me on this, and frankly, Lou Garcia gets all the credit and I don't. But it's a handy tool. We'll give it to you. This is smart money. And if you want to get a professional assessment done, as Kevin said, go out, get some of that state local cyber grant money. That's the way to pay for an assessment, especially if you want to do it against the NIST cybersecurity framework, because it's the one the government gave us to use for this purpose. So that's smart money. Use grant funding, bring in an assessment, look at your gap analysis and your corrective action plan, and then use the next round of grant funding and the fact that your request has been informed by the results of that assessment. That's a real good way to use grants. Planning resources, including incident planning, funding resources. There's a lot of funding resources out there, but again, grant funding is one-time stuff, and the governors have to get it together and make this stuff durable and sustainable. Here's a bunch more handy links. We're not going to go into these, but a lot of the information, especially in the history part of this presentation, was drawn from a lot of these. So knock yourself out. You have a year's worth of reading here. And with that, let me just tell you a little bit about what we do here. We have a combination of managed and professional services that in aggregate can tick off any box in the whole cybersecurity world you might need ticked off. So we can provide you with senior level guidance through a virtual CISO. We can do your penetration testing for you. We can help conduct those assessments for you. We can go through your policies and make sure that your policies are up to snuff and will survive scrutiny by an auditor, for example. So I don't know if Virginia, you want to cap us off here with anything, but back to you.
Thank you guys. What a great conversation today. Kevin, will you please tell us a little bit about Alvaca before we sign off?
Yes, Alvaca's been in business for a little over 40 years. We are a traditional integrator VAR MSP, but we have focused over the last 5.5 to 6 years heavily on enterprise to mid-level restoration and recovery from ransomware. We are one of the top, if not the top firm globally in doing that. And so we are certainly here to help you. We are also here to help defend against this stuff. One of our primary services is enterprise patch management and vulnerability management in a way and at a better level than most companies you will find. We also do a lot of your traditional development and implementation work for your network services, everything from design and implementation to monitoring and management and help desk. So very traditional company with very good legs in the world of ransomware restoration.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And if you'd like to learn more about Alvaca, please check out alvaca.net, which I've dropped the link for you there inside the chat as well. And if you'd like to stay connected, I've also left our email addresses for our speakers, Kevin and Michael, which you can find here in the chat as well. And we'd like you to stay connected with us for our daily IT security news blast, which has been curated by Mike Hamilton for the last 15 years. There's a link for that as well. We do have free, emphasis on free, monthly security awareness trainings, and that is actually coming up this month on the 19th. And we have also regular online urgent panel webinars and additional podcasts. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Pisces, which Mike mentioned a little bit earlier, you can check that out at piscesinternational.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. Final thoughts, Bjorn, let's start with you.
The biggest issue here in my mind is always going to be funding. One thing that I want to make explicitly clear, the overwhelming majority of security products and services these days are on a subscription model. And without annual funding, you will be struggling to succeed. Whatever pressure we can put on our elected leaders in terms of closing that gap is critical at this stage of the game. I am also seeing a faster pace, and correct me if you're seeing something different, because the Alvaca guys see things on a much bigger scale than I do. But I'm seeing more incidents in the last 2-3 months than I have seen since the early days of COVID, which felt like the Wild West for a while. We are in a very dangerous time, and you have a limited amount of time to resolve security issues before it's going to be a very big problem for all of us.
Thank you, Bjorn. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Really focus on the basics. While you're waiting for funding is not a time to sit around and do nothing. Every step you take towards better hygiene is an improvement. Think of life in cyber as a board with a bunch of holes in it and a marble rolling around. The more holes you close, the less likely that it is for that marble to fall through. So close as many holes as you can and get with it. And then from the perspective of what's going on with the threat actors, we've seen the government successfully take down groups, but they're like a hydra. You cut off one head and 3 or 4 members go off and start new ones. And unfortunately, now they're even less professional in the sense of how good they are at what they do. And they do more destruction than they do than the more organized groups are. So it's a very bad time to be making mistakes. Please get the basics right. Focus on that first. Don't worry about shiny things until you've done the basics.
Mike, final thoughts.
Take it seriously when the EPA says we are going to enforce against the language in the Safe Water Drinking Act as amended. They mean it. So don't wait for your governor to say something. At a minimum, ask us for the spreadsheet and start filling this stuff out, because then you have documentary evidence that you took this seriously. Avoid that claim of negligence, because they look serious about this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. Thank you to our audience. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
All right. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.